Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, I'll now call Australian Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group. You're a busy man, a working group of just yourself?
I'm just the chair and representing the working group today.
Very good, tremendous. All right, now, let's make it official. I welcome Dr. Chris Preston from the Australian Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group. And for the Hansard record, if you could please give your name and state the capacity in which you appear today.
So I'm Dr. Christopher Preston. I'm appearing here in my capacity as chair of the Australian Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group.
Right, now the committee has received your submission as submission number 19. Do you wish to make any amendments or additions to it, Doctor?
Not at this point.
Do you wish to make a brief open statement?
On behalf of the Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group, I think that they would like me to say that one of the most important things that we can have in Australia is to have a rigorous, scientific-based risk assessment for pesticides so that we get products that farmers can use and use safely, that are safe for the environment and are safe for consumers.
Thanks, Dr. Preston. Now, I quoted you earlier, so I better give you the opportunity to go further on that quote. So, before I get to that, you've been 28 years in this industry, with the Australian grains industry, that's right?
I've been researching.
In research, yes,
yep.
Sorry. So what's your experience with the APVMA?
Well, I've had a number of interactions with the APVMA over the years, mainly in the areas of spray drift, but more recently, well, actually not so much more recently, but since the introduction of herbicide-tolerant genetically modified crops, I've had substantial interactions with the APVMA over that issue because they regulate the herbicide side.
Have you found their performance, or not performance, I shouldn't say, their decision making has sped up over the last few years or slowed down? Is it efficient? Is it suitable?
Look, I think that, in general, my feeling has been that they have been dealing with issues in an effective way. Don't necessarily want fast decisions on everything because some things are complex. However, as you quoted from me earlier, it has certainly been my impression that the disruption caused by the move to Armidale has really slowed down the potential introduction of products that I was hearing about that we might have in time for sowing in 2019. I'm now being told that they're going to be in 2020. I had a meeting with UPL earlier this week about a product that I've had a little bit of involvement with, and the case manager for that product has now left the APVMA, and they were hoping for a release in time for sowing in 2019, and it's unlikely that'll happen now.
Did the APVMA give you the reasons why they're going to take hopefully it'll only be another 12 months before they make the decision?
Well, the APVMA doesn't talk to me about those things because they're between them and the companies. The discussions I have with the APVMA are much more about sort of more policy side decisions. So what is the approach that we should take over the management of over-the-top herbicides in the Australian environment to manage resistance, for example.
Okay, so considering the recent series of political events and its impact on the APVMA, particularly the ones you mentioned in your submission, do you have confidence that the APVMA can continue to undertake their regulator responsibilities?
I certainly hope that they will.
We all hope. No, we all hope.
I think I said in my submission, it remains to be seen how long it takes for them to get back up to speed after the move. Certainly. They have lost a lot of staff, and it's not always easy to attract staff of the right calibre to this particular area. It is a very specialist area, and you don't have lots of people available for it. But I'm certainly, would expect that, in time that they'll get back to what they were. Okay, and look, it's no secret now, we're all supporters of the APVMA. Well, I am, no doubt about that. But I have been very critical of the uphill. Greatest respect to the town of Armidale and surrounds, and that's not my argument. My argument is where the heck we're going to find all these scientists, because we know a lot of them aren't going to move away from Canberra.
Anyway, the APVMA have clearly said that it's all rainbows and unicorns, and she'll be right, and let's hope they're right. So with the forced relocation by the government, what impact do you think it will have on the independence, real or perceived lack of independence?
Well, I don't really think it'll change their independence at all.
Good. Stakeholders you've spoken to share the same belief?
Generally, yeah, the stakeholders in the Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group, and indeed the people I've spoken to outside in the companies, don't really feel like it's going to change that.
Good, I hope so. I certainly hope not. Okay. Senator Brockman.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Yep.
I guess I'll just start with your expertise in the use of glyphosate, particularly in agricultural context. Could you talk us through your view of the science of the safety of glyphosate?
Okay, so I'm very much a scientist. I'm going to take a scientific position around this. So I've looked at the research that's available around the safety of glyphosate, and from what I've seen from the research, I am confident that if used according to the label, that glyphosate can be used in a safe manner, and I have made no changes to the way that any of my staff use that product.
So in terms of the APVMA's regulatory approach to glyphosate, you believe that they are correct?
I think they have made the right decisions around the safety of glyphosate, given what I've seen from the data.
You heard our earlier exchange with Bayer about the IAC decision. Do you have any comments?
Well, I think that one of the things sitting as a scientist that was strange to me about that particular decision was that they made the decision without actually using all the data that was available. And I would have thought that that would be the process that you would take into consideration in making that sort of decision. So you mentioned the agricultural health study, but they also ignored some of the higher quality animal studies that were out there as part of that decision. So, it was, in my mind as a scientist, somewhat of a strange move.
Have you had any feedback from fellow scientists or through the working group or the agricultural community as to the concerns I've heard from the agricultural community about that particular outcome?
Look, I mean, I speak a lot to farmers, and farmers are telling me the same things that you mentioned earlier, that they are concerned about how this has happened because they've been told for years and years and years that glyphosate was safe, and suddenly here it was, it was a probable carcinogen. Did they have to worry about it? And those sorts of things. And so there has been a lot of concern in the agricultural community. The researchers that I've spoken to about it, who are across the data that's available, generally fall into the same view I do, that is used according to the label. It should be safe.
Now, Dr. Preston, I saw a presentation of yours on this topic at a conference, and I don't know if there's proprietary information in the slides you presented at that conference, but it would be very helpful if there's not, if you could provide that to the Secretariat so we could include some of that information in our final report. In particular, I recall a slide, and I don't recall the detail, but where you showed that the range of scientific outcomes from the analysis of glyphosate showed that basically the range was it went from had a mildly protective effect in terms of cancer to having a possible negative impact. Is it possible for you to share some of that information?
I can do so if you wish.
Post haste.
Yes.
Obviously, can't do
it today.
Can't do slide presentations during a hearing, but no. If you could share some of that
information.
No,
I'm happy to do that. All that information is actually publicly available.
And can you just talk us through that briefly, that the fact that there is that range of information out there, and you have to look at all the information in order to make a proper assessment?
Well, I think this is about all of the studies, the human studies that have been done for glyphosate and cancer, and essentially what they indicate is that there can be a range of outcomes, and this is actually normal for epidemiological studies. Where there's not much effect is that you'll see in one study you might see a slight positive effect, in another study you might see a slight negative effect. But what you're really looking for amongst those is, are there particular situations that are falling consistently in a negative area. So, you know, are you getting, with exposure, a particular type of cancer that's falling in a particular negative area? What that particular slide showed was for most cancers there wasn't. There is a couple where the means were tending to fall in the negative side of the ledger, so potential that there might be some issues around carcinogenicity. But, you know, further studies, and particularly the agricultural health study, and I think we can't, you know, that is the biggest study we've got. It's a longitudinal study. It's very large. It's over 20 years. You know, it really didn't show up anything of concern.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Brockman. Senator Ross.
Yes, look, I'll just start with that agricultural health study. So that's peer-reviewed. Can you talk us through a bit more about that study?
Well, so it was a large study of more than 50,000 applicators of herbicides. One of the things to remember about the US is that most farmers don't apply their own herbicide, somebody else does. Followed these people over 20 years, looking at cancer and their use of pesticides generally. So they've actually been looking at all of the pesticides that the farmers have been using. But this particular bit that we're talking about was the glyphosate bit. So they looked at what their glyphosate use was over that time. They interviewed them twice over glyphosate use, and their conclusions out of that was that there was no statistically significant impact on any cancer that they looked at. And when they looked at non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is actually a cancer that is somewhat higher in the agricultural community than elsewhere, is that they didn't actually find anything significant there, and there was no significant trend with the amount of glyphosate that was used. So the people who used the most glyphosate were no more likely to get that cancer than the people who used the least glyphosate. So there was no dose response, no significant effect.
And that study and those findings from that study, so they've been published.
They've been published.
Right, and obviously there's been academic scrutiny of them. Have there been criticisms of that study as well, and the findings of that study?
Oh well, there are always criticisms of scientific studies, as I well know. But many of the criticisms that have actually come out around that study, it's the criticisms about how can you know how much product a farmer uses, and I think that this is a reasonable criticism, but in a longitudinal study you're actually in a lot better shape than you are in a case control study where you're looking back, particularly around cancer. So in a longitudinal study you've got the opportunity to ask people while they're using products what they're using. A lot of the earlier studies, what they've relied on is actually getting people who've had cancer and people who haven't and asking them what they've done. And sometimes the people are actually dead, so they're not actually asking the person who used the product what was done, they're asking the next of kin what they did. And, I don't know about you, but I sometimes struggle to remember what I did 20 years ago.
20 years ago?
Let alone what your spell.
No, I know what I did this morning.
Last night.
So, one of the issues we have with a lot of epidemiological studies a real long time is that unless you've got very, very good evidence about what people did, they can always be a little bit sort of fuzzy around the edges.
Okay.
Sorry, but in the case of this particular study, as you say, in the US, the vast majority of chemicals are applied by
Applicators.
Contractors. That's the word
Contractors.
I was looking for. So you would have a fairly good idea about potential dose at the very least.
Oh, yes, yes. So this would be a better way of doing it than looking backwards, but it's not without its flaws because they've only asked them twice over that period of time, rather than necessarily calling them up every year and going through their records.
Yep. But my point is, if you worked as a contractor for
you would have a better idea.
15 of those 20 years, presumably you're going to have a higher exposure.
So I mean, going to where we're at post the IARC finding. I mean, do you? And we've got the APVMA that said they've done a review. Are you satisfied with the extent of the review that APVMA have done post the IARC finding?
Yes, look, I think they've come to the right conclusion, and a lot of that's based on the fact that I have read the US EPA review, which in my opinion, is the best review that's been conducted on this area.
So
And they came to the same conclusion as the APVMA.
Well, I think it's because they basically relied upon exactly the same evidence base.
It's exactly. They're
Exactly
based
the
it
same.
on
So they
all
were
the available
obviously going to
data.
come to the same conclusion with the same evidence base.
That's
I
right.
mean, do you feel, given the question marks, raised by the IARC finding, that there should, and following up from our conversation about some of the problems with some of the science that's been done, is there a justification there should be what further science potentially should be done in order to put the question marks as raised by the IARC study to rest?
Well, in my view, despite the issues that I mentioned about the agricultural health study, I think that's quite compelling evidence that we really don't have a major issue with cancer and glyphosate use. But undoubtedly, there will continue to be studies.
Yes, but
So
I
don't
suppose
know.
the question is not so much that there will continue to be studies as to whether there should be a more independent,
they've been
comprehensive assessment than.
The agricultural health study is ongoing.
So should there be changes in the way that's being undertaken to overcome the concerns that you've got about it?
Well, I don't have any major concerns about it. I was just pointing out some of the issues that were raised and how that might actually slightly affect the results. But as I've said, it creates fuzziness rather than going that these results are no good. Yes, in my view, it would be better if they could interview the applicators more often to get a more accurate picture of what they're applying. But that would really be the only change that you would look at. But that comes at the downside of, harassing people about what they're doing all the time and losing people to the study because they don't want to be harassed.
Okay, are there, what other, you've got the longitudinal study, is there other, further studies in terms of exposure assessment, for example, that should be undertaken?
Well, we have a very, very large body of work already available around exposure assessment of glyphosate. And you say the US EPA review was very comprehensive and included consideration of every piece of evidence that they could get hold of, including them writing to companies and requesting evidence from the companies because they found studies were there that hadn't been submitted. And it had a very, very large number of studies. And I think that you will eventually get to the point where so many studies have been done that you end up with high confidence in the result. And I think that's my position around glyphosate and cancer. I have reasonably high confidence that glyphosate is in its normal use pattern not a human carcinogen.
But that's yes, in its normal use pattern. But how about in terms of the way? In the US court case was the use of it, was very heavy exposure over many years, which is very different to the way that somebody using it sort of erratically and every so often uses it.
Well, of course, we have a lot less evidence about that because we don't really encourage people to use products in that sort of fashion. The label specifically has statements on the label about personal protective equipment. It also has statements of what you should do if you are exposed, and one of those is that you should wash yourself. You should shower immediately and change clothes. And we don't do studies. We really don't do studies of people doing the wrong thing.
Right, okay. So in fact all the studies that have been done for the uses, are they presuming that people are using it the right way?
Well, you have to presume that people are following the label. The label's a legal document.
But
in the same way that you presume that, the vast majority of people follow the speed limit. we know not everybody does, but, you build your roads based on the fact that people are going to follow the speed limit.
But we know that there are so many people, like Senator Sterle's mate who's, using it, wandering around in the lawn in his bare feet.
Anymore.
I think you should buy him some shoes.
And we have already heard stories of people who use it regularly, sort of on an agricultural basis, they end up being drenched in it, and what the impacts of that may be.
Yeah,
but
look,
you're saying
we can take this, I think, to its extreme, but I don't think that's helpful.
But what you're saying is that the science on the safety of it presumes that people are using it as directed.
Yes,
Yeah.
Well, sorry, can I clarify that? Because I would have thought some of the science would assume that, but for example, the animal studies.
Oh, yeah, well, so the animal studies go to very, very high doses of glyphosate, way over what anybody would ever get exposed to ever. But animals are animals, and I think one of the things we need to remember is animal studies only give us an indication of what the potential issue might be for humans, particularly when we get into some of these, weird and strange cancers that animals don't tend to get.
But even something like, sorry, Senator Rice, but even something like the agricultural health study, it wouldn't assume that it's based on what people's exposure someone had. It doesn't.
Or what they report. You know, they may not be reporting that they're using it inappropriately.
It's actually it's the reality of what has happened. So whether they've followed the label or not, it's still the reality of what has happened.
That's true, but as a general rule in these things, the assumption is that people are going to use it as specified on the label.
But my point is that's not based on the outcome of the study is not based on whether they did.
No, it's not based on whether they did. No, but it's the general assumption is in these sort of studies that people are going to be using it as specified on the label.
Can I just finish up, and I know we're out of time, the call for regular reviews of chemicals, what your thoughts about that? I mean, you said in your submission that it's important there are reviews of existing registered pesticides. This should be on the basis of new information becoming available either through the scientific literature or through issues in use. I mean, do you think that there is, in addition to that of new information, that there is value in having a regular time-based review?
Well, in some respects, yes, but in other respects, this is a bit of an issue, because if you're just reviewing something and nothing has changed, it's all a bit of a waste of everybody's time. I think that, the APVMA is looking after hundreds of active ingredients, and if we were to have a review timeframe that was too short, they'd be doing nothing but reviewing existing products, which would just waste everybody's time. I think that far better approach is to take either there's been an issue out there, or when there's been a change in process, and this is one of the things that we do see, the change in process, and then there is a review of products and new information has to be provided because we've discovered something about something else. One of the issues we do get to with reviews of agricultural products is that once products get off patent, companies are much less likely to do any work to protect these products in the marketplace, because the return on the investment is going to be very small because you have a large number of generic players. And so part of the risks we would run of having a too tight, too firm review process is that products which are perfectly safe, for which we've had years and years of safe use, would simply not get re-registered because nobody would present the data. Because they couldn't make any money out of doing so, because of all the generic players in the marketplace. We have hundreds of generic players in the marketplace in Australia.
But then we have to find some way of overcoming that, because...
Well, if you could overcome the market failure issues, then I think we could discuss having regular reviews.
Because, I mean, all those generic uses of it should also be reviewed. But if you've got multiple, people making money out of the same product, you've got to have some way of...
This is one of the things that we struggle with in the Australian Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group, is how do we get those generic sellers of glyphosate on board about the recommendations we're making to farmers about glyphosate use. It is a real problem.
Are you concerned that there are products that have been available, in fact, the ones that were essentially brought over into the new regulatory regimes that actually haven't been reviewed for, 20, 30 years?
Look,
where the science has obviously changed and we've got much better ways of, assessing their safety now.
I think I think you remember that the APVMA is often, when it's looking at doing reviews of products, it's actually looking at the most widely used products that we have. We have some products that are very niche, very small usage, and they're probably the ones that are in that space, have been around for a long time, that the data needs to be updating. In fact, we did some work with one of these products to get a new registration for it, and that's exactly what had to happen. They had to bring in new data for that. So there are products out there, but they generally products of very, very small usage and so of low risk. And I think that the APVMA has taken that attitude around them. And so for small marketplaces, they could be very important products, but yeah, who would do the work to get the review done? That's my problem.
Even if they're only small use, they may be, in fact, have significant impacts that haven't been reviewed using current science.
Look, I think the thing is that they'd be low risk because they're not being used very much. So their risk to the consumer and their risk to the environment would be minimal because there's almost no use.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Preston, thank you very much for coming today, and we know where to find you should we need anything else. And we'll now go to the airwaves. So.